And we are live with a very special guest today. I am extremely excited to welcome Lyn Alden to Ideas from the Edge. If you haven't heard of Lyn, you're probably living under a rock. So very excited and honored you agreed to come on the show, Lyn. For those of you who kind of know what we're getting at with Ideas from the Edge, obviously very experimental. We love talking with people from, early tech communities like Bitcoin and Nostr, but the hope is that we're going to talk about all kinds of weird stuff. So whatever comes up, nothing is sort of out of bounds. And yeah, I'm really excited to have this conversation. Thanks for coming, Lyn.
Yeah, happy to be here. And like I was saying before we recorded, we don't get a chance to catch up enough in person, so it's really cool to have some virtual interactions in the meantime to catch up.
Totally. Okay, so I have many things I want to touch on with you today, and obviously whatever you want to touch on as well. But the first thing is, I feel like, it's fun when we get to chat in person, but I've learned a lot from you over the years, reading, and listening to you on other pods. But the thing that actually you have changed my life the most with, you don't know this, but in a really, really big way, yeah, the Bitcoin, the macro, that's all cool. But you actually have made a meaningful impact on my life. And that was, I don't even know if you remember this, but you put out a blog post. It must have been, I don't know, 2020 or something when I read it, about like minor health hacks. And you had two things in there. One was taking magnesium and the other was eating sardines. I started doing that. And I will say both have been great, but magnesium, like, seriously has been one of the single biggest things to change my life ever in the last 30 plus years. So first of all, I want to say thank you for that. Second of all, yeah, like how did you discover that? Why do we need magnesium? Is the topsoil depleted? Like what's going on there?
Yeah, good question. I wrote that originally in 2017, so it was one of my earlier posts. And at the time, I think it was my longest one. It's since been eclipsed by some of my longer ones, but in an otherwise finance blog, I have this like one outlier health post, and I even because I don't want to be seen as like giving health advice, I phrase it as how to boost energy, and used combination of personal experience and a lot of citations for science. Um, but I went down this whole rabbit hole of like health and nutrition in the early 2010s. So, I mean, even before then, like in college, I switched to vegetarian for a while and then
Oh,
continued that. I was a vegetarian like strictly for like 6 years.
cool.
Um, and I initially did that for ethical reasons. Like I didn't like factory farms.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the Holocaust happening to animals all the time. It's just
Yeah, it's
horrific.
fucked up.
Um, and um, but then I kind of started to come across like permaculture, like more like holistic farming practices. Um, the importance of like grass-fed animals and well taken care of animals, and how that can be sustainable both in terms of their well-being and then the environment itself. And I generally found that I do better on a low-carb diet, and so I switched back to omnivorism, but with emphasis on quality and trying to be mindful of where I do that. I had this whole like long research rabbit hole into like seed oils, inflammation, um, all these different aspects of especially nutrition, but also more broadly, how to be fit. I kind of grew up doing martial arts, so fitness was always a big part of my routine. Um, and I did an experiment with ketosis for a while. So I would literally, I would eat a ketogenic diet, and then I would literally like prick my finger multiple times a day to check my glucose, check the ketones,
Wow.
see what the threshold was, like how many carbs do I have to eat to be under the threshold. Um, and I would do experiments on like my inflammation markers. So I kind of did like an n equals one, um, just test. And that's kind of where that blog post came from. It's just kind of like cataloging all the things I'd researched and then tried and narrowed them down. The magnesium one came just because I was like, okay, there's a million supplements out there. I'm just trying to sell you a supplement. What are like if you had to pick like five, what are like the ones that kind of actually fix things?
Right.
And that one just kept coming up with really high signal, just because we have depleted the quality of our soil a lot. I'm in the whole permaculture space. I'm a soil maxi now. Like I think people underestimate the importance of soil.
Yeah.
Even when it comes to like environmental stuff and like people are talking about like carbon in the air, there's more carbon in the soil than the air. And it's how much where carbon is not just a one-way street. It's not just about emissions. It's how much do you then pull back into plant matter and soil. and that's the part that always gets left out of the equation. Um, but magnesium, I think we have a widespread deficiency of it because we don't really have the nutritious foods and good soils on average that we used to have. Um, there are other things I looked into, like for example, vitamin K2 or um, vitamin A. Some of these more like um, less well known vitamins than say vitamin C or things like that. If I actually probably plan on going back and updating that whole list. I probably would add cold plunges to it. That's been my latest little experiment. I was kind of a chicken, so I pushed that away for a while, but I finally did research and trial on that, as well as the importance of regular walks and sunshine. I would probably emphasize more than I did in the initial piece. I've kind of come to appreciate the benefits of vitamin D you get from the sun being somewhat different than what you get in nutritional form, as well as other benefits from the sun, as well as just general benefits from walking, even compared to other types of exercise, just because of how long you can do it for and that kind of low grade walking. But I think that one of the biggest subjects that you could possibly study now is just how to live a life that's kind of a little bit closer to how we evolved to live. We've radically changed our lifetimes, our like life patterns in the past 2 centuries, and that I mean it's great that we have like indoor plumbing and like electricity and like we can have this conversation on screens, but it like kills our eyesight. It gives us depression. It makes us obese. It's got all it kills our teeth. Like pretty much all the things that we're geared to do are then challenged by our current life cycle. And one kind of the modern health approach is to then patch that with medicines and this and that, and just kind of like don't change the foundation and just keep patching it over. Whereas I think that obviously the more sustainable way to do it is to back up a second and say, okay, well, we want elements of modern life. We want to be able to talk online and work from our computers or work from home. But how can we not lose some of the key like health benefits of being more aligned with nature? And that's been more than a decade long exploration for me. And I don't always succeed at it, but I'm always trying to be conscious of it just because my work is sedentary and on a screen all day. And so then it's like, how can I do damage control?
Totally. And I think most people listening to this podcast are probably in very similar
Yeah.
positions. And I think I mean, it's the most important topic in the world, right? Like if you're not feeling good and you don't feel healthy, like what does any of the rest of it matter, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a whole bunch of rabbit holes you just opened that I want to dive down. But the first one, I just realized again, I'm also not a doctor. Lyn's not a doctor. Blah blah blah. But in my personal experience, I didn't even mention what this was. The reason magnesium was so powerful to me was it allowed me to sleep much deeper, and it still does. To this day, it's the only supplement that I take, sort of like exogenously, not in food or whatever. But it really, like, I can tell a major difference. If I take magnesium, I feel like I get a much deeper sleep state. It doesn't necessarily help falling asleep as much for me, although sometimes it does. But it's the quality of the sleep is better. I do sometimes worry, is this, bad to have any dependence, right? Like sometimes I think I should take a magnesium break just to not become dependent on that too. But it's the most notable sort of change in my life. Up until what you just mentioned right now, which is the two big things that I've changed. And it sounds like we're kind of headed in similar directions. Are over the last couple of years, since maybe 2021, at the end of COVID, I started doing two things: swimming in the bay in San Francisco, which is extremely cold, so cold plunge, and then doing extremely hot saunas before and after. I know, so you're a cold plunge maximalist. NVK is a sauna maximalist. Shout out to his site, banya.lol, which I found last week, which is great. Those two things have been huge for me. Are you also, do you have any, I don't know, opinions on, cold plunge by itself versus cold plunge contrast with sauna? And if you do that, do you begin with cold and end with hot, or how do you think about those?
I do like the sauna cold plunge combination, or failing that, hot shower and then cold plunge, depending what you have available. I came across it because I go to the Oslo Freedom Forum in Norway sometimes, um, and it's obviously like sauna country up there, and
Yeah.
then they have some very cold waters that you can plunge into, and At first, like when people were saying, okay, let's go in the sauna and then jump in the Arctic, the Arctic Ocean, in like northern Norway. I'm like, yeah, I'll do the sauna, but I'll pass on the cold plunge. Like I don't mind heat, but I don't know if I want to do the cold.
Yeah,
Um, and I thought it was like kind of like showing off or like just like a fun thing to do. But actually, when I dug into the research, I'm like, oh, you actually get like a really big spike of like all these like kind of bodily chemicals that can be good. I think in general in modern life, we kind of dull the edges a lot,
yeah,
like which is a good thing because it means we don't die from exposure. But it also means that we don't get maybe enough stimulus that our bodies are kind of expecting, and we can kind of fall into a rut because of that. And so
yeah.
I think occasional cold shock is good. I do research on it, so I defer to published studies as well as just my own experience with it. Um, I've seen that there's a good case to end with cold. That basically like that kind of process of like slowly warming back up really kind of gives you that deeper impact of the cold. And that's generally how I do it. And it's actually not as hard as it sounds because it's almost like you're so cold that you're not really cold anymore, and then as you heat up, it actually feels kind of it feels pretty good.
Yeah.
Um, so I when I do it, I always end on a cold cycle. And I've been really exploring that just because it's like you can get like it gives you like a big increase in like dopamine and like adrenaline, and not in that like short term way, but it can last for hours, and keep you really focused. Then there's other research on the potential metabolic benefits of regularly doing it. Um, but I just generally find that it's good to shock your system from time to time and vary things up, because I think we're geared toward that.
Yeah, totally. And in my experience with the cold, I mean, something I like to describe to people, I also was doing Wim Hof breathing for a while with my dad. Like sometimes we do that. It's a lot of fun. But, if you haven't seen him, the Iceman, he's all about the cold. But I think one thing that really stuck with me, both when he said it, but also my own personal experience, is like that shock when you're in the cold water, there is no room for luxury beliefs. Like you're like in touch with like base reality. Like when you're about to go to cardiac arrest, like it doesn't matter what stress is happening at work or like, whatever, any stories you have running in your mind, like, no, you're there, whether you want to be or not. And I think that's like a very powerful, I've often thought, and again, I'm not a doctor, but like there's, like you said, a lot of just, I think, lethargy, depression, general anxiety and unease as we go through this transition from kind of, the old biological organisms that we are to now biological plus mental organisms connected. And I think, at least for me, I think in the long run, and it's all going to take care of itself. Evolution does its thing. But the cold shock and shocking the system, like you say, is a very powerful tool and benefit for those of us that are in this transition period. And I do think that anyone that was depressed or unhappy with their life, like spend 10 minutes in really cold water every day and let's check back in a month.
Yeah, I think there's really low hanging fruit that people can do. People are prone to different things. Some people are prone to anxiety, so it's almost like how do they want to chill out? Other people are
Right.
maybe more prone to that kind of unipolar, kind of lower energy state, like depression symptoms. If I err in one direction, it's toward that kind of getting stuck in a rut or lower energy or lower mood. And so things that shock me up from that, things that can enhance that. That's originally partially why I explored a ketogenic diet. It wasn't because I wanted to lose weight. I've never been overweight. Instead, it was like there's various claims around how it can impact your mood. And so it's like, well, let me actually just experiment and experience what that's like. Um, and then same thing when it comes to obviously exercise, very well known for its mood. Sunshine is really well known, maybe not as much for its mood. And then cold plunges. And then the cool thing is you have a pretty big tool set of things that you can cycle through. Maybe you don't want to rely on one thing, but you have all these options to kind of either change your metabolism a little bit or give yourself some healthy shocks from time to time, um, and really kind of explore probably what the body's a little bit more intended to be like. Um, you don't want that like Wall-E future where everyone's kind of like being driven around and can barely stand up, and like that's not a very fun life. So I think it's how to take modern life and then combine it with some of the things that our body needs that we're out of tune with. And then it's also like a strength of character thing. Like people have their different touch points or pain points. And for me, like cold water is just so unfun. And so that's why I was like, but it's almost like for me, it's like I hate relaxing in like water that's a little bit too cold. Like if there's a pool, like I'm only enjoying it if it's like nice and warm. But a cold plunge is different. It's like gnarly. You know, it's just like you go in, it's a huge shock. It could be like 40-degree water, like whatever you're doing.
Damn, that's cold.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's a whole different level. Like as cold as it gets here in the Bay, even in the winter, it's like 47, 48. Like that's cold as 40. That's some
I've
serious.
been doing the high 40s at the high end, and then down to like the low 40s.
I'm
Um,
impressed. That's for
and
those of you who don't know that's extreme.
but it's it's short, and you get this like really big burst. And I just I think people should try it once, maybe try it a few times,
Yeah, I love it. And
safely.
yeah, exactly. We're not
We're not
doctors.
doctors. If you have
Do
a
your my yeah.
heart condition,
Do
check
your
with
own
your doctor.
research. Blah blah blah. So that I definitely want to talk a little bit more about your sort of your own experimental adventures with reality, let's say. But before we do, two last things you mentioned, one here now and one, I believe maybe it was a Nostr post or something. You mentioned vitamin K1, I think. I don't know what that is. How do you get that? And then on Nostr, I think you mentioned that you also sprint. And I've been looking a little into high intensity interval training. Is that something you've settled on as like part of the routine too? And if so, why?
Yeah, so for I mentioned vitamin K2.
Okay, too. Thank you.
Basically, for a while, people didn't really differentiate the types of vitamins. Um, and like you can get vitamin K from like leafy greens, for example.
Hmm.
Um, but there's a second type of vitamin K that we get. There's a couple ways to get it. Generally, for example, when a cow eats grass, they get vitamin K, and then in there, for example, their butter, like
Hmm.
very high, like rich grass-fed types of butter. Um, they'll kind of turn that into K2, which
Hmm.
is more absorbable for us. And the initial like research on this was done by Weston Price.
Hmm.
That was one of the earlier kind of natural food movements. And they might not agree with everything that they put forth, but he had this kind of like he discovered it before he had the tools to fully discover it. He's literally like there's something that like cows are eating and then turning into their butter that there's a nutrient there that we need, right?
Hmm.
And he advocated like that combined with like cod liver oil for vitamin
Okay.
A,
Okay.
basically liver, because what they generally found, like if you ever looked into like osteoporosis, it's actually like just taking some calcium or just taking some vitamin D doesn't necessarily help a ton with it, oddly enough. It's not just like you have a deficiency in something. One thing that they found generally K2 does is it helps like get the calcium out of your soft tissues and then push it to where it should be. Pushes
Yep.
it to your teeth, to your bones. It's kind of an important component, it seems to be, of that whole complex. Um, and so generally that organization for like a while, like a century, has been an advocate for not being without vitamin A. Obviously, that's fat soluble vitamins, like the ones they're talking about, are ones that you could overdose on. Like it's not like vitamin C where you can have a ton of it and be fine. Like there are limits to how much you should have, but some of these fat soluble vitamins are pretty low in our modern diet. In our factory farmed dairy, we're not we're not really getting vitamin K2. Same thing with like your pale yellow yolk eggs from like
Yeah.
depressed chickens,
Gross.
compared to like those like dark orange, naturally like pasture eating happy chickens. Um, there's certain fat soluble vitamins that again research has shown um, that we benefit from having that we're in aggregate deficient in. So I generally take the vitamin A and the vitamin K2 argument pretty seriously and make sure that I don't want to be completely deficient on those. Maybe I'm not like I don't necessarily eat them regularly or religiously, but it's not something if I'm it's one thing I want to touch on from time to time. For sprints, partially it's a matter of taste, which is that there's certain like I've always hated jogging, like just long jogs. I've never vibed with.
Yeah.
But for example, I grew up kickboxing,
Mm.
and that's a sprint basically. When you're fighting all out, that's a sprint. And then you relax a little bit and you sprint again. Um, and so that kind of sprint has combined with like slower bike rides. Like if I'm gonna do something slow, I'd rather bike than jog. It's just a preference thing.
Yeah.
But then there is a lot of research showing that like at least like once a week, people probably should sprint. Again, unless they have a heart condition or something that would otherwise you want to check with your doctor. But being able to like push yourself from time to time, it's a completely different metabolic state than that slower motion.
Yeah.
Um, and opening those pathways on a regular basis and kind of making sure that all that machinery is still there, it's not just being like deprecated, is useful. And plus, it just feels amazing. Like
Totally.
if you do a sprint and then you like do a sauna cold plunge or something, you're gonna feel pretty good, I think, for the next several hours.
Yeah, I agree. I get a similar state, I guess, when I'm swimming and I try and swim like brief period, basically sprinting, like brief periods, but
Yeah.
really fast. And I love, this is one thing I love about your analysis of things, Lynn, is that you have the ability, and I think both are very important to be on both the left and the right side of the bell curve. Yes, you've done all the research, it's all there, but at the end of the day, left side, like it feels good. Of course you're going to do it, right? Like, and I think that's probably the best advice there is, you know?
Yeah.
So one thing that I want to touch on in general, as you think about this, and this maybe expands into other areas of life as well, or your research or whatever, is you seem of uh, of the people I know in investing land or whatever, you seem one of the few people that is genuinely seeking truth. And I really like this idea that you said of, it seems like you're always running experiments, and always trying to see like, yeah, like what actually you do your research and what does it actually feel like for me? Is that something that you've always had, or there practices that have helped you, become more like that, less likely to get swayed by, just caught up in narrative or dogma or stories? Or yeah, is that just sort of intrinsic to how you've always been?
It's a hard question to answer. I mean, it is something that I think it's come rather naturally to me. I mean, there are other areas that I'm naturally weak at. That's an area that I think I've naturally been pretty strong at.
Yeah.
But then, because I've studied philosophy and I've studied, critical thinking, and I've, um, it's not very like pleasant looking when you see someone stuck in their own bias, and then it's
Yeah.
it's become pretty clear and self-reinforcing. So obviously, if you see someone else like that, you want to think, how can I not be in that state? Um, and no one can be perfectly objective, but by having that tool set to basically, am I thinking about this critically? Am I being sufficiently flexible with my thinking? Um, are the incentives that I have making me think a certain way compared to if I didn't have those incentives, right? So I think it's a combination of naturally just kind of being a strength, but then really trying to lean into it and be like, if there's one strength to have, either for if you're doing almost anything, if you're running a business, if you're running a fund, if you're providing any something that involves being right about things, you obviously want to have your like your correlation attached to truth as much as possible, for your own benefit. And then especially if you're any sort of like public brand, like if I have an audience, um, I mean, in the modern era, there's been a really big problem of audience capture, where people they get a certain audience and then they realize like, well,
Yes.
if I deviate from what that audience wants to hear, then I'm going to lose some of them, and then they kind of get more toward that audience, and then they're just feeding the echo chamber. Um, and I mean, that's an incentive problem again, right? So in some cases, people say, well, it's better to be funded by your audience than from sponsors. But then it's like, I mean, if you're 100% relying on your audience, maybe then you start feeding what they want to hear, unless you can deliberately craft your brand to keep reminding your audience that you're going to challenge them. That this is a place for people that want to be challenged. We're not just going to speak to the crowd here. And I think that's where some conscious attempt comes in. That basically I will purposely put out like a provoking tweet or something like that, just because it's like, if I think that there are too many people that would be concerned if I say this, I got to say it now. Like it's like I got to just kind of cull that like 1% that's gonna be mad about this.
Cold
To,
shock your audience.
yeah, cold shock my audience from time to time. Cut the fat, and remind people that this I'm not just doing this for like entertainment, meaning like I'm just gonna speak to what you want to hear, make you feel good. I'm gonna challenge myself and challenge the audience, and I think that's if you have that as like your North Star for your brand, that's a conscious effort to resist audience capture or falling into a delusion and an echo chamber that seems really right because you've kind of crafted it so you're only hearing those narratives and you're completely separated from the bigger picture.
Yeah, no, I love that. It's something I think about all the time. As someone who also is a fund manager and invest in a space. I think you and I are both obviously very bullish on Bitcoin, and I think we're probably right on that. But I do think from time to time, like I've tried consciously to avoid, even though my fund invests in Bitcoin stuff, just being a Bitcoin fund. I'm much more interested. Okay, we have money for the internet now. What? Um, Precisely to try and avoid some of that group thing, because it's very, like, if you listen to the same people every day and see the same things, it's very subtle. It's like the frog boiling water goes, and I think even in myself, even though I have a relatively small public profile, I still find myself guilty of that. And it's one thing that's helped for me is also to have friends that are really skeptical that will push back on me and be like, hey, I don't necessarily drink the Kool-Aid. I see your arguments, but like, what if you're wrong for this? And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, when you start realizing one like big I don't know, eureka moment for me was like, if there's ever something that makes you mad to hear, that means you're probably just going out on a limb with beliefs. Because if
Yeah.
someone says like 2 + 2 is 4 and someone else comes and says, oh, no, it's 5, you're not going to get mad. You're just like, this person's wrong. But if someone says like, hey, what if, I don't know, something terrible happened with Bitcoin or something, it's like, okay, I start getting a little nervous given how much I've, built on top of that. And again, I mean, I feel pretty confident in my position so far, but it's always healthy to have that like external, um, either internal yourself or external people questioning, saying what if. And I always try and check myself. If I start to get riled up, it's like, okay, there's something here I need to watch and pay very close attention to.
Yeah, and it helps us see because there's so many examples of this in investing that are visible. So if you leave the Bitcoin space for a little bit, I mean, there are people that like 10 years ago thought that the market was overvalued and so they're going to get into like gold miners instead,
Right.
right? And they just sit on dead money for like a decade and then they kind of have to double down and triple down and deep into like the value rabbit hole and like, it's like there's a lot of managers that are just like fund managers that are just stuck in that position. They were too valuation sensitive on tech, and it kind of threw off their whole thesis, and they can never really kind of shift out of that.
Right.
And I've been aware of that because I my initial like investing research as like a kid was like value investing,
Mm,
buying things that are like more cheaply priced than you think they're worth.
right.
Always been kind of allergic to high valuations.
Mm,
And it's something I've had to consciously push back on and be like, well, like if the tech is real and the growth is there, you have to, you can't just be a deep value investor. You have to, have a framework for what we want to pay for different levels of growth, for example, and that flexibility of thinking and being adapted to a growth at a reasonable price investor is kind of a strategy that's out there. It's, maybe not like like in public markets, I generally prefer profitable companies because if I'm going to go unprofitable, I might as well do it in venture. Uh, but like
for sure.
basically it's like, hey, I'm willing to pay up if something's clearly got growth and a network effect and a fortress balance sheet,
Yeah.
because I've been very aware of like what it looks like when people get trapped into their own circular thinking. And then in
Right.
the digital asset space, I mean, there are like cults around like the 150th biggest token, and they still
Yeah.
think that they're one day the market's going to see that they've been right all along. And I mean, there are like a whole bunch. There's like dozens of like these little niche communities where people are just so entrenched in their thinking, and they're just melting compared to Bitcoin. And it's like, they're like 8 years in and they're like, no, it's like, we're gonna get a little bit more volume and we're gonna rocket back out of this like hole we've been in, and we're gonna get out of like we're gonna get back into the top 100, and then from there we're gonna get back to the top 10, and like, we're gonna, and it's just, you don't want to get stuck in these traps. You wanna have opinions on things, but then be very data dependent. Even in terms of like macro, um, it's like when to be bearish, when to be bullish. There are so many moving variables. At like we were talking before about nutrition.
Yeah.
Like basically anything that involves like economy, like financial markets, nutrition, climate. These are systems that are so complex that no like one model can just like account for it.
Yes.
There
Exactly.
you're trying, it's just at least at their current level of technology, maybe 500 years from now they'll map out everything, but like right now the human body is so complex, the climate's so complex, the global economy is so complex. um, Things like Bitcoin, where you have an intersection of technology and economics and politics and all these things combined, it's just like, and then the whole space, like, what's the ratio of this versus other thing. These are just very, very complex things, and they require having a thesis, like having a framework that helps you organize it, but then be willing to iterate that framework as new data comes in, because you know that you're only capturing like 20% of it, and you just have to make sure that that 20% is like getting you 80% of the way there, and then constantly retweak how your model gives you that most important data based on what you're seeing.
Totally, I love that, and I have a lot of thoughts on this. I mean, one thing is, um, I will go ahead and say one thing I am pretty confident on, although I guess I'll never say never, right? But I don't think we'll ever get good enough to model, the world, and this is one reason I'm both very bullish on AI, but also skeptical on the whole AGI thing. I don't believe in that at all because there's trade-offs in life, and also because I'm talking about this in some of the other podcasts. I had one with Stu from Blossom and Satellite.Earth where we talk about Nostr and a bunch of other stuff in evolution, which was one of my favorite conversations of all time. And like one of the big takeaways that we really try to get across there that I think came out of that is, to put it formally, the sort of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. A member of a set is not the set, full stop. And so even like the AI model that you have within the substrate of reality or whatever you want to call this, it can never model all that because it's within a larger system in itself. And so I'm just in general, this is one of the reasons I've been very skeptical and concerned, from at least just sort of moral or ethical standpoint with any really smart person or organization that thinks they can control the system, because whether that's OpenAI, whether that's governments, whether that's anyone that thinks no, like we just need a little bit more tech and we can model this thing that's literally like I would argue provably impossible to model because it's part of a larger set. uh that's where I think really bad and sometimes heinous and evil and even evil things can emerge. Not because the person or the group is evil; they probably have really good intentions. But what is it? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So I'm very skeptical of that and very concerned with anyone that thinks they can control a system.
I agree, and I think that's actually one of the biggest. I mean, that's kind of the whole divide in the 20th century. The
Yeah.
capitalism versus communism thing, and that's still not over yet. That's still like it just keeps changing forms. Um, and then it becomes, well, there's so much disinformation online. How can we make sure that people get the right information? But then it's like, well, what if the government itself is a source of disinformation, which in many places it can be, and to varying degrees. And then it's like, well, if we like they've tried it with the environment now. It's like, well, like let's try to quantify the entire environment down to one number, CO2 levels in the air, and let's just like, reorganize society around optimizing that number, right? And that then there's increasing pushback against that. Whereas if you ask people, do you want the environment around you to be clean? Of course, we want clean air, we want clean water, clean soil. Um, we don't want like just companies just dumping like chemicals into our river. And luckily, that's actually improved a lot since like the 70s. Even like Robert Kennedy, for example, his whole thing was like focusing on that the river systems and trying to, so whatever you might think about his politics or his health, but he was like very focused on literally river cleanliness, and that was actually a really big thing that actually improved over the past several decades. It is fixable. Um, and so like one consider yourself basically you can consider yourself an environmentalist, but then say maybe it's more complicated than one number, because this is a hugely complex global system with a bunch of different inputs and outputs and a lot of things going on. And two, a lot of people just put forth certainty around a lot of this, whether it's economic planning, environmental planning, social planning, online censorship plan. Like it's just, I agree with you that basically all these top-down things are, a lot of it's tied to hubris, sometimes good intentions, sometimes bad intentions, and that they should be generally resisted.
Yeah. One of the rabbit holes that you piqued my curiosity with is permaculture. I've come across permaculture a lot on Nostr. I've come across it from other friends who I think have very interesting ideas. I have not gone down the permaculture rabbit hole myself. My understanding is obviously trying to look at things more holistically, more systemically, understanding that, if you try and just plant a whole bunch of trees to get rubber from them or whatever, of course, that's going to lead to, monoculture and then death, versus a truly complex ecosystem has all kinds of little things you don't see, the microbiomes and blah, blah, blah. Well, if you were to give us just the brief TLDR on permaculture and where curious listeners or myself included should start the permaculture rabbit hole, what would you recommend?
Um, One, yeah, just Google it, look it up. But the way I would summarize it, it's a lot of resources. But The summary is that it's a basically raising food in such a way that tries to mimic the balance of nature
Mhm.
rather than isolate it into its individual components.
Right.
Another way of saying it is that it's a way of raising food where like the roots are not torn up every year, right?
Right.
It's kind of a basic way to put it. So in the way that we do modern agriculture is we separate everything. We say, well, let's, instead of having, nature is plants and animals in this cycle. The plants feed the animals waste and recycles back into the plants, and you have this like loop that makes sense is when you have sunshine and water. Um, and we just separate that loop. And then the thing is that actually creates its own problem. So, for example, when you're trying to grow plants, well, now you need fertilizer because we took away all the animals. So we have to get fertilizer and put it on. And then we have to, we have pest control. I mean, one of the best pest controls is like chickens. They when chickens are pecking around and eating all the pests, they actually
I
can
love it.
can yeah, and but you took them away. So now you have this like isolated artificial forest of crops, and they're all the same crop, which means you don't have the natural dynamism and diversity and protection of nature. You have this one big thing where like this one type of beetle can come and just like annihilate the entire forest of identical trees or the entire, every corn in the field. Um, and then you have the weak, you kind of extract from the soil, and you have pretty weak soil quality. Um, if you look at roots of modern plants, like they're bred to be like super small because like then the machine can just come up and like rip them out way easier compared to like roots, from like decades ago. Like even if you just look at like a wheat plant and like the modern version versus like the older version, and those deeper roots are one, they're really good for building soil, and then two, they extract nutrients from the soil. They're not just like sitting on the top in this like thing where they've only been for a year. Um, and so a really basic example of a permaculture is grass-fed beef. So you have this grass field, and it's not the grass you think of as like in your backyard. This grass, like the roots can go multiple feet deep. They can go like 5+ feet deep. There's like
Wow.
cross sec, yeah, they're like really deep. Um, and the grass does not just get torn up all the time. It's this permanent recycling, feature of just this grass field. The cows eating from it, um, living their lives, and then that the cows are fertilizing the grass, and the grass is feeding the cows, and it's getting energy input from the sun and from the whole water cycle. Um, and that can actually be a pretty sustainable way to do things. And so there's this like I forget what it's called. There's this orchard in like California, for example, and they've been doing the whole permaculture thing. Well, they'll have like an orchard where all these like they'll have olive trees, and then they'll have stone fruit trees, and they'll bring like the goats through for like their natural lawn mowing, and they'll bring the chickens through. And occasionally they have to apply something to deal with some sort of minor pest or something. I mean, they're still being scientific about it, but by incorporating as many plants and animals together, um, you replicate nature in a way that is maybe not optimizing for the dollar in the near term,
Right.
but it's optimizing for quality, and then that property can just stay like that indefinitely because it's being really well run, and then it's better for the animals, it's better for the people eating it. Um, and overall, I think that we should be spending more money on our food and less money on our healthcare.
Yeah.
That's kind of the trade-off. That like
Sure.
some of this is not cheap, but it saves you money elsewhere down the line and in a more pleasant way.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. We're talking obviously a lot about permaculture in the context of agriculture, but I think this kind of like ecosystem thinking is applicable in a lot of areas, including information and how we generate and consume that. Maybe we can use this as a segue, you know, to begin to talk a little bit about Nostr, and perhaps if you see sort of Nostr as the permaculture of information online, what got you excited about that? And beyond Nostr, are there other tools or I don't know strategies you have to try and make sure you're getting a diverse ecosystem of information inputs? Just how you think about consuming that.
Well, so for the latter ones, I guess easier. I purposely will identify people I disagree with that I think are the smartest people of that opinion,
Yeah,
and then follow them on purpose. Because a lot of people I agree with and like, I naturally just follow what they're saying without having to force myself to. Whereas I want to purposely go out and expand the diversity of information I get by following someone that I, might not usually agree with, but that I think they're a reasonably honest actor, and that they're kind of steel, like the steel man of that view, is what I try to do. For Noster, I guess, I mean, to use the same analogy, like with agriculture, we silo everything. We put all the corn over there, we put all the chickens over there, we put all the cows over there. We kind of silo everything, and that's what we've done with social media too. Um, so whereas like email, now email has centralization issues, but I mean the cool thing about email is that it's interoperable. So your Gmail and your Yahoo and your Outlook and your Proton Mail, they can all send emails to each other because they're all plugging into the same underlying open source protocols like SMTP and some others. And what we see in social media is it's evolved a different way. Facebook has become a very isolated system, and so has Twitter, and so has TikTok. We have these kind of isolated ecosystems, and Nostr basically comes along and says, well, here's kind of the open source protocol for social media and other things as well. But basically, it's saying, okay, kind of like how there's SMTP for email. Here's this basic ability to send signed notes and to relay signed notes around, which can be used for a variety of social media and other types of information. And it's extremely simple. Some of the criticisms are that it's too simple, but generally speaking, what makes a protocol successful is it's kind of as simple as it needs to be, and all the complexity is obfuscated to the sides of the network or higher layers of the network or things you can solve with money. Whereas like the underlying protocol is just kind of like this like really basic language that things plug into. Um, and I just think that makes so much more sense than the current isolated system. And I think that as governments increasingly want to like control information flow and KYC everyone on their platform, and then all that leaks out, and people get increasingly frustrated. And I think that it pushes people toward some of these more open source solutions. And then also, I think that some of the applications that can be built, like even if someone doesn't care about censorship resistance or like freedom communication tech and all that, I think that there are some just iterations that can happen because there's that open source layer. Like if I want to build something cool on top of Twitter, it's hard to do because it's a lot of it's closed off. Whereas if I want to build something on top of Nostr, I can just go and do it because I can just plug in, get the data, I can like connect to it. There's all sorts of stuff you can do, and so you have that network effect of all these really energized developers from around the world just building really cool stuff. They're like, hey, here's this wallet that like uses eCash and Nostr together. Or hey, here's this app that like is kind of like Substack, but it's on Nostr and it has cool features that make use of, the underlying Nostr protocol. And here's this other thing. And here we have differences of opinion on how clients should work. And so you can pick your own. Or hey, here's an algorithm marketplace. So that you can have more agency in terms of how you sort through and discover information rather than having a small number of centralized parties tell you this is how we're going to sort information for you. And I think all of that it's early, it's small, and it's ragtag, but it's powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think most of the people, at least listening to Ideas from the Edge of the Past, are probably into Nostr. We talk about it a lot. For those who aren't, I think to sort of encapsulate briefly the things that I consider important about Nostr. One, it's permissionless identity generation. You can generate your own identity without any company, without any government. In fact, interestingly, it is just a Bitcoin address, but that's a topic potentially for another day. And then two, you post every message you post is signed. That's very important because now you have some sort of authenticity tied back to identity. And three, you post these messages to a variety of servers or relays, which means anyone can take that data and down, build whatever experience they want. So the first big thing happening is obviously social media. Imagine if you could exit Twitter and plug into Facebook or vice versa. But now we're starting to see other things, like you said, Substack. And I think, we mentioned this in a pod we were on last week, but I think one of the best examples I'm trying to point people to right now to see concretely what the potential of Nostr is with Fountain, the podcasting app. So I build up whatever my whole community of followers, people I follow, they follow me, my identity on Primal or Damus or any of these Nostr social media clients. Now I plug that same identity into Fountain, a totally random podcasting app. And all of a sudden I can see that same social graph. It's like, hey, I follow Lyn on Nostr. I've zapped her a lot on these topics, permaculture. I think she's really smart on permaculture. Great. Now, on Fountain, I can surface podcasts she's listened listening to that she's recommended. And eventually it'll even be more specific. I could be like, hey, find Lyn's favorite podcast on permaculture. Boom. And it gives it to me. And if you try to imagine that today with Twitter and Spotify, obviously it's impossible because they're two closed systems. So that to me, that potential is what gets me so excited. I'm curious for you. I mean, a lot of investors early on, I think, particularly for someone from your background coming from more sort of public stuff, like Nostr is very ragtag. It's a bunch of hackers. This is the most fun, but like you have to really kind of like look into the future to see where it's going. What was that eureka moment for you, and how far do you think this goes? Do you think we end up rebuilding the whole web on top of Nostr? Is it a 10x bigger web, a 100x bigger web, or is that a little too fantastical?
Uh, so the eureka moment for me is probably when I see things bootstrapping. People can theorize about what should work or what they're building, or hey, I got this really complex scheme that no one uses. Um, but it's like you go on there and it's vibrant and people are using it, and there's a bootstrapped ecosystem. And network effects often start in a denser area. Like Facebook's network effects started with a handful of, Ivy League colleges, for example. They achieve critical mass in a very tight space. Um, and the fact that Nostr, right now it's very Bitcoinery, which is fine because that's kind of an initial fairly dense network effect, which it then can build from. The first thing was just saying, hey, this is simple. I know that protocols that win tend to be simple, and it's not always the best tech. It's the tech that people start using, building on, and that is good enough. And the network effect says, look, you can optimize things all you want. You could make something that's twice as good but 10 times more complex, and no one's going to use it. Um, and just the fact that it's working, it's here. Um, so it's like unless I see something on the horizon that starts to kind of eclipse it and take it's kind of like it's the winner until it's not. Is how I view it. It's also an idea. Like Bitcoin is a technology, and it has to work for the idea to persist. But it also challenges other systems to be more like it. So like when you see a system that has like zero long-term supply inflation or is permissionless, or hey, here's how we can do a ledger in an open source way, you start challenging other systems and say, well, why don't you open source, or why do you have so much supply inflation, or why do you do this? And with Nostr, again, it's software that works, but at the same time, if one client says, hey, look, we have algorithm marketplaces now, you can pick your own algorithm. Well, you can go to closed source social media and say, hey, like, do you guys want to implement like algorithm choice, algorithm marketplaces? Why haven't you done that yet? um, and it can even shape other things that are not itself because it's a new entrance. I mean, no, right now it's still tiny, but I think it's a powerful set of ideas that can spread. And I think, for example, normalizing the fact that you should be able to sort data how you want to, rather than like the platform just gives you one or two ways to do it. Um, because they want the marketing dollars or they want the social control or whatever the case may be. Um, I think that there's going to be kind of that renewed shift toward people want to not be the product, they want to be the user. They want it geared toward their practice, not toward geared what makes a company money. Um, and so I think it's a powerful set of ideas. The second eureka moment was realizing how much better it makes payments, the importance of unilateral payments. Um, and that, I mean, it happened a couple times organically. Like someone was like, I did someone a favor and they're like, hey, let me pay you back. I'm like, don't worry about it. And they're like, no, like, let me pay you back. I'm like, don't worry about it. And they're let me do it. And I'm like, it's funny because they need my permission. Like they can't just pay me because they need me to give them like a lightning address or like an on-chain address or a bank account. And so I'm like, I mean, if you really want to, like, just tip me on Nostr, right? And then they did. And it was actually a payment for something that was not a tip done through a Nostr's app. Um, and then um, it came up again, like, I did multiple like Uber rides with this person. I'm always like, let me pay you back. And they're like, no, it's fine. It's like, a few bucks. And like, no, let me pay you back. And then eventually I'm like, well, now I can just do it without your permission because you're on Nostr. So I can just send you 40 bucks and make up for the handful of Uber rides. But basically, whenever you're like paying something, if it involves both parties doing something, that's a friction point. Whereas just being able to look someone up and pay them is super powerful. Venmo figured that out, and this is the open source cross-border version of that. All these different pieces plugged together and give you an open source international Venmo. And it's got pretty good network effects in the Bitcoin space. So I can't, it's still a small ecosystem, but among Bitcoin people, it's not that small. Um, and so you can just unilaterally pay people, like, I mean, and this is a public example that when I did that broken money video,
Hmm.
Guy Swan did some of the audio editing for quality control, and that was a fairly small project, and it's like, he's like, hey, just here's the amount, tip me on Nostr.
Right.
And it just, yeah, that's how we did it. So we paid for something non-tip related on Nostr. It makes wallets way better. And so that combination, and in theory, you could build a giant payment directory. Hey, everybody put your Lightning address here, but then how do you keep that updated? Who controls that server? How do you know that there's not 10 fake Lyns? Like, how do you know the right one? And that's where the web of trust comes. It's like, well, all my friends follow this Lyn, um, that's and the algorithm saying that one seems to check out. This other one only has like only one person I follow follows her. That's probably a fake Lyn. So you have this like self-organizing, self-correcting payment directory because it ties into that social network aspect. Um, as for how big it gets, I mean that's those types of open questions I struggle with just because in theory it's like why not the entire internet
Agreed.
and why not bigger than the current internet as we know it.
Mhm.
Um, but network effects can be very sticky. Uh, Profit incentives can be very sticky, especially when the government's involved. They can be very sticky if you get kind of like, fiat currencies are very sticky. Network effects, same thing for social networks. Um, um, Questions around like key rotation or key control, like some of the technical details, like how's that going? What does that look like in 10 years? Kind of like how is that easier to use and easier to be safe with compared to it is now? Um, there's like I have lots of questions for how big it'll get, but I think that the total addressable market of it is huge. I mean, it starts with all social media, any sort of messaging, um, like review sites or just any sort of media, like you mentioned the podcast thing. Like if there's a podcast that like I like this podcast and you're like, well, I want to see the podcast she likes. Um, when I look at like let's say I'm going to look up a show to see what it looks like on IMDb, I can see the number. So it's like, okay, a lot of people rated it. It seems to be pretty good, but it'd be really cool to then also have my friends like near the top of that list, so I have a qualitative metric there too. So I'm like, hey, like, this show is pretty highly rated, but also like, this person XYZ who I know likes a lot of the same shows I liked also gave it a 10 out of 10,
Right.
even though the average is 8 out of 10. So I'm like, maybe I would like it more than the average because these two people that seem to have similar tastes as me also like it. Like I watched an anime just because one person on Twitter was like talking about it, and I know that I like the same shows they do, so I'm like, let me just try it. And that's how one review is more important than 10,000 reviews.
Totally.
And I think any sort of like content sorting, in addition to those quantitative metrics, your own web of trust can really improve that.
Totally. And that's something I know we touched on a bit last week as well, but something I'm really bullish on is, and I'm sure we'll talk about AI a little bit here in a minute, but in an age of AI generated, crazy amounts of content and AI curation, I actually think there's going to be a counter swing with the human curation element as well. I think that's going to become very valuable. And one thing that I love with Nostr and your own personal web of trust is you can sort of have DJs for everything. And it's super easy. It's like, to your
Yep,
point, I really don't care what 900, 99.9999% of people recommend for books. But, for you with a specific book on macro, of course I'm going to care. Or, for Stu with a book on evolution, of course I'm going to care. And that DJ for everything concept, I think is something that really only can happen on Nostr because again, the interoperability and you're going to see so many interesting surprises where it's like, who knows what that leads to? We may find because the data, as you said, has been siloed previously, the new correlations, relationships between data we're going to find, like I think there's going to be some shocks. Like for example, I've often said, I wonder, like, if you had a dating app or a recruiting app based on music choice, like, is that one of the best predictors of, finding the right hire or the right spouse or whatever? Like, maybe we don't know. We've never had that before. And I think there's going to be a lot of those kind of like really interesting relationships that are, just brand new because it's open.
I agree. I agree, and you can only know that because it's open. You can explore it. Like it's you can't like in Twitter's early days, it was more open, but then they purposely closed it off. And that happens to a lot of things. And so having open data sets and interoperable data sets, and like a web of trust can be useful in isolation. Like on Twitter, there's a web of trust, which is, hey, like I follow this person and like 100 people I follow also follow this person. It's probably the right one. But then I can't say, well, this whole social network we have is really valuable. Let's apply it to this other area. We can't because it's all closed and locked in. And so Nostr, you have that web of trust that you can then apply to whatever you creatively think would be useful to have some sort of social graph or web of trust attached to, and you can see
Yeah.
what works.
So just to play sort of devil's advocate here, I think we're both very bullish on Noster for many reasons. I think you said this as well. And what I was trying to get at is that it's permissionless and it's hard to build something simpler. And it has like an early and dense community of like diehard fanatic adopters. Great. So those are all very, very strong reasons for. And I really do think like it's like seven, fields in a JSON blob. Like it's really hard to build something simpler than this, maybe impossible. And so that is what gives me so much confidence on Nostr is the simplicity and the early adoption, and the potential it has. Now, let's say we have someone listening who's a more traditional Silicon Valley person or whatever, and they say, "Okay, cool, I'm down with the open, I'm down with the thesis," but we see a lot of competitors now. We see uh, Farcaster, we see Blue Sky, we see a lot of other things that are trying to get at this. If we're being sort of intellectually honest with ourselves now, again, because they're not as open, it's hard to like actually vet these numbers. I tried and posted on Primal the other day some GitHub star history for each of these repos, which is interesting. Nostr is doing certainly for its position in time, but in absolute terms better than any of those, with the exception of Mastodon and IPFS, which have much longer histories and are slightly different anyway. But how would you answer that if you were being intellectually honest with someone like, how do you think about making a big bet on Nostr versus some of these other ecosystems?
I would say that the other ones like Blue Sky and Farcaster, they raised VC capital.
Yeah,
So that gives them some rocket fuel early on, but it also can distort their incentives and make things less sustainable than you otherwise would think. Whereas when something is bootstrapping so foundationally through a lot of it's grants. A lot of it are just like grants or Nostr developers just doing things because it's super exciting. And then around the margins, there's some VC funded companies, really early stage, not a ton of money. We've seen a similar thing in the Bitcoin space, like where during the whole like 2021 cycle, it's like Bitcoin's being left behind and everything else is blowing up. And when you look at VC funding, like like TVP, like they published, I think, like an annual report on the state of like where venture capital is going, and like
yeah.
the crypto ecosystem had like 50 times as much as Bitcoin. It's
It's
like,
wild. It's actually
yeah,
crazy.
it's insane. It's like a 50-to-1 ratio. It's like for every billion we get, they got like 50 billion. Um, and um, and yet Bitcoin market cap's like as big as the other ones combined, and there's no central entity. It's just this self-reinforcing thing, and it's like so some people were using that as like a bearish thing. Like, look how little venture capital Bitcoin's getting compared to the rest of the space. And I'm like, that's not as bullish for you guys as it sounds like, because it means you're throwing tens of billions of dollars at this, and you're barely like keeping up. Like you're like, and it's not sustainable despite the fact that you're outspending us 50-to-1.
Yeah.
Um, and so when I see like Blue Sky and Farcast, it's like, well, sure. Um, but then the caveat is that they're more centralized. There's more capital consolidated in a small number of entities that are kind of dictating where those are going. And like in theory, you have this open source platform underneath it, but then in practice, there's like generally one big entity that's kind of governing that whole thing.
Exactly.
Whereas Nostr is kind of beautifully messy in that regard. So it's a little bit more inherently organic and truly kind of grassroots, I would say. Um, and I think to the part where I would agree with them is that I do think I tend to think this will take longer than some of the biggest Nostr bulls think.
Yeah.
I tend to be on the bearish side of bullish, if that makes sense. Um, like the cynical bull, where I'm like,
Yeah.
I love it, but it's people are not going to change right away. Um, and there are clunky aspects, there are speed aspects, there are like security aspects, I think we could benefit from either child and parent keys.
Yep.
That seems to, they're basically ways to like fix errors sometimes that are otherwise unfixable.
Yep.
Um, and and I also don't think that censorship resistance sells as well as people think it does. Like among Bitcoiners, there's this whole self-sovereign, like approach, but a fairly small percentage of people prioritize that,
Okay.
and that really limits a market. Um, And so that alone is just not like that's not the argument that's going to get you to 1 billion users.
Right.
Um, it's got to be that the apps themselves are just better because they're making use of that open data, that they're doing things that could, in theory, be done on Twitter, but they're just not being done there because it's all closed off, right? So when you can just go in and say, okay, here's a similar thing, but this data set's open, we can then go build something on top of it. We can use that social graph for another purpose that is interoperable with the former purpose. Um, that's where I think if it's going to win, it's going to win. But I do think it's a slow burn because it's not that initial sugar rush of VC capital that just gives you like this massive money like runway. Instead, it's this really kind of bootstrappy, self-passionate thing.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, and I think your take is both very realistic and exciting, but also like sober and real, and I think it's important to have that. I also agree with you that like on the self sovereign thing, like the reality is like even if all of the bad things or centralizing things in the world happen, like maybe we get from like 1% of the world that wants to hold their own keys to like even 10%. Let's say like it's crazy bullish explosion. The vast majority of the world's still not there yet, and maybe one day they will, but I don't see that happening anytime in the near future. So one thing that I always focus on with Nostr, like you said, is what is unique about this? Like what makes my life better? And that's why the best example I have for a normal person today is the Fountain app, because they can see, oh cool, imagine if my Twitter social graph came with me to Apple Podcast. That's brand new, and that's in my opinion very special. The Bitcoin tipping as well is pretty interesting. But anyways, I totally agree with you on like novel use cases of the thing. Two of the things that I'll just mention for folks that are maybe a little deeper in the space as well. I think we focus so much on the social media side, and that's great. And it's like, I think of social media as the global water cooler, where you need that to have this group to basically discuss, here are the new ideas I'm trying. And over time, that'll keep self reinforcing itself with every new explosion of a Nostr app. It'll come back and help the social media, until one day, I think, perhaps Twitter will plug into Nostr or will overtake it. Who knows? But that's a long term proposition. The areas where I'm seeing a lot of adoption with Nostr becoming the standard are actually very unsexy and behind the scenes. The thing that I'm perhaps most bullish on short term, well, there's two. Let's say short and medium term. Short term is Nostr Wallet Connect. If anyone hasn't gone deep on this yet, nwc.dev. It's something that came out of originally Albi sort of published, but it's an open source standard. Now you have tons of companies building on this. And I'm seeing this within my own portfolio. Normal mainstream exchanges are looking at Nostr Wallet Connect basically as an infrastructure layer to solve problems with getting Lightning invoices or some of the technical complexities of using the Lightning Network. And it's just using this like existing relay system in a way that it was not at all intended for. And that's the thing that excites me so much about Nostr. We just need to survive long enough that a lot of these new use cases, like very boring plumbing for payments, popped up. But if we hadn't had Nostr with the social media, that would have never gotten the chance to start becoming the standard. So that's one area I'm excited about. And then the other is truly open AI. And this is something that I actually wrote a post called like actually OpenAI wins. And this was maybe a year or two ago. But the thesis of it was basically like, if you truly want, if you want to let evolution do its thing, you need an open ecosystem, like you were talking about with permaculture, for these bots to survive or to evolve and to grow. And I think that I'm very skeptical, and maybe we can transition a little bit here talking about AI, but very skeptical of monolithic AI. I think that there's all different kinds of intelligence in nature, and there's trade-offs. I mean, as an engineer, like you can't just be good at everything. Like no, like if you're a really big person, maybe you're really strong but not as fast, and vice versa. And so, for me, one of the areas I think is extremely underexplored that I would love to see more people playing with in the Nosters, how do we create, one, just Python tooling for it, because that's what all the AI developers are playing with, but two, more examples of bots with money, energy-backed money, that can just go wild and like evolve on the internet. So anyways, those are the things I'm most excited about. Are there any areas, if you could wave a magic wand, sort of like RFPs, requests for projects, that you would like to see more people focusing on or experimenting with the Noster?
I mean, it's really hard to because there already is so much experimentation.
Yeah.
Most of the things that I want to see people are working on. They're trying to figure out how to make clients better. They're trying to figure out how to I want to see better key management stuff, just to make it easier not to like lose your key somehow, like have your key taken. More basically more safeguards between your like root key and these apps. Um, Ongoing usage of just more apps, just to see what works. And I'm bullish on the bots. I think the agents with money is a real thing, and it's going to increasingly be a real thing. And that can be as simple as like data vetting machines, like a bot that does something, you pay it, and it does a thing for you. Um, or agents that are more flexible and can go out and do stuff for you. Um, Marketplaces on Nostr involving human and AI agents. Um, Whether it's things like CoinJoin organization or buying and selling different things. I think that basically that's a powerful layer to help with some of those things, like any things that have been kind of attacked in a centralized way. Um, this is a potential tech path to somewhat decentralize them and kind of a help with the coordination problem. Um, and so, while bots in some ways are problems, and I think that's basically like, anyone can, especially in the future, anyone can just raise an army of bots and go out they're all, as far as we can tell, basically passing the Turing test at some point. And it's hard at first glance to really know. Like you just, without very detailed questioning, they're effectively human. Um, and you've got that like problem where like you don't even know if you're alone on the internet. Like these could all be bots, or like 90% bots. So that is like a problem, but then also good bots that are going out and filtering things for you and sorting things out for you and solving problems for you and interacting with other people's bots. That's an area where this could be bigger than the current market, just because, like that's what energy and processing does. It like back when humans had to farm, you using like your own caloric energy to farm, and then we would say, okay, let's expand this and have animals help us farm. You'd have horses pull our stuff, so we're like getting better scaling. And then you make the tractor and hydrocarbons, and one farmer can do the work of 10 farmers now. And the same thing can kind of happen with AI, which is, I mean, these are energy intensive processing, and they involve a lot of sophistication, but they can save us time. They can go out and do things. They can, a lot of things that are repetitious or that they're just better geared toward, they can do, and they can expand the pie because of that.
Yeah. So let's shift a bit and talk about some of the, macro tech and AI stuff. On the one hand, we have our smaller freedom technology groups of Bitcoin and Nostr, and that's all beautiful. On the other hand, we're living through what appears, from my vantage point, to be like a truly not just like business cycle change, but like societal evolutionary change. You're seeing some of these big companies, all of the hyperscalers raising insane amounts of money or investing in insane amounts of money in companies like OpenAI and Anthropic. The amount of build out right now happening on the chip side, on the energy side is wild. And we could do a whole podcast just on the energy stuff, which is crazy. I guess from a high level perspective, what are your general thoughts on what's happening here? Like, do you think that are we going, at least in the short run, in a more centralized world where there's only going to be a handful of big winners, like potentially OpenAI and Google? Do you think that I don't know, 2 years out, the next ChatGPT 5 is so good that like that there's just unforeseeable consequences? How do you think about what's happening in sort of contrast to our small but fervent decentralized tech community in the larger centralized AI world?
I think this is a continuation of the cloud computing theme. So that was already a centralizing force, which is that instead of running your own stuff, you can just like outsource it. It's cheaper to let big entities, run the processing environment, for a lot of your stuff. That's inherently centralizing. Um, and then I think AI is basically an extension of that. It kind of just kicks that into overdrive. So I do think it's centralizing in the intermediate term. Um, and then to the extent that you need energy, a lot of energy,
A lot. Yeah.
that can also be centralizing. Um, the good news, I mean, it's almost like they're snatching victory from the no, they're snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, because they get this big lead in terms of like research and money and all this, and then they go and kind of like filter their own system, like they restrict their own system and they make it like kind of less based than we want it to be. And that gives an opening for tech that's like a year behind,
Right.
um, but it doesn't have that like it's self-imposed handcuffs on itself, and so it should be like a year behind, but it ends up being only like 6 months behind, or in some cases better, because it's not restricting itself. And then there's the privacy aspect that there are, I mean, if you're a business and you're putting all of your like data onto the cloud, you're giving data, you're giving like important intelligence from your business into other companies.
Yeah.
Um, and so there's an argument for like AI privacy. So there's two vectors there where the big players can kind of screw themselves over, which is handcuffing their own models and harvesting all the data, which can like lead some people to turn away. So I think that there is going to be a pretty vibrant ongoing market for more decentralized types of AI. People that don't want either their data harvested or they don't want like the filter on it that like ruins its effectiveness. Even despite being well-meaning, not trying to like that's the problem with centralization. It's almost like if they don't modify their own algorithm, then like one mistake affects everybody.
Totally.
Whereas all these like smaller models, it's like less catastrophic when one of them gives you wrong answers, and things like that. So I think that there is centralizing forces, but that they kind of undo themselves in a way. One of the more concerning things is that basically nobody other than NVIDIA is making money on this. Like even OpenAI is losing money for the foreseeable future. So it's like you get to like what, like 100 million people faster than anyone else, and yet you're still like nowhere in sight for profitability. Um, so there's all these entities that are buying all the GPUs and just losing money on them. And then the question is, do we slow down for a little while and kind of like clear out some of the excitement and then go to the second phase of like, okay, how is this more economically sustainable? Because if you make a business out of selling $20 bills for $10, that can grow really quickly until you just
Right.
run out of money, until your investors get tired of like lighting money on fire. And then when you start selling $20 bills for $20, your
Yep.
growth rate dries up because it's actually balanced now. Um, and so if you're undercharging for AI, you can get faster growth numbers than you think. But then when you actually start to charge for it, it might slow down the growth or give us a period of digestion where we say maybe we bought too many GPUs, and we gotta just chill out for like a year or two, and then but then you go back to real growth because it's actually there is there. It's just that when people they're rushing and they're excited and they want to scale up better than the competitor, regardless of if they're losing money on every query. Um, there's probably a reckoning at some point, and it doesn't mean the end of the space. It just means I think a digestion period and
Yeah.
then higher.
Well, and to be clear, for people that are listening, they'll, part of the reason this is structurally different, the AI wave, than, other waves, including some cloud, although cloud has some of this similar, is that the, there's variable costs here. Anytime I make a
Yep.
query, and I have some sort of inference, like I have to pay to actually run the CPU. It's not like, okay, I built a piece of software and yeah, I have to like run the data center, but it's like pretty small comparatively. You can think of it as zero marginal cost. It's not zero marginal cost. It's the variable
Yep.
cost scales with usage, which is different than we've seen other waves. So that's
Yep.
very interesting. I have heard other people obviously, compare this, is this like, in the internet wave, we had all this like fiber built out and that was like a terrible investment in the short term. In the long run, Google ends up taking it all and like, of course, then builds great stuff on top of it. And yeah, I think those are all very reasonable arguments. What would you say to someone who feels the AGI, so to speak? I don't know if you saw that Leopold dude from OpenAI talking about some of his situational awareness paper. He's like, no, look, there's like an S curve. Intelligence is going this fast. It's been going that way since Hans Moravec talked about it 60, 70 years ago, whatever that was, or people before him even. And no, like you just like all costs be damned, the next exponential leap is going to be such a powerful tool that if you can beat your competitor there by 6 months, this is the nuclear arms race on steroids. Like, what would you say to someone who has that view?
I think part of it is people sell their own book.
Yeah, that's fair.
Kind of like if you're trying to raise capital, directly or indirectly, you make your industry look really big. I think there's merit to. I think that's the framework that people are using right now when they're gobbling up all these GPUs. Is saying, well, we want to be ahead, because you don't want to like pinch pennies and fall behind. And I get that view. Um, in general, I'm not as bullish on AGI in kind of the intermediate term as a lot of people are. And I tend to think that a lot of some of like the truly profound things from this are going to come out of like left field. Like,
Yeah,
everyone's focusing on AGI, but for example, I think that like medical breakthroughs could like really shock to the upside in the next decade because of AI. Because like you can iterate protein folding. You can do like 6 months of like protein folding simulations in like a day now, or whatever the scaling number is. Like basically that repetitive exploration type of research with very complex systems can be dramatically improved, or like just mapping out someone's body, mapping out someone's genes, doing some sort of therapy to fix a problem. Um, I wouldn't be surprised to see the rise of like trillion-dollar healthcare companies,
Yeah.
which everyone's focusing on AI, but it's like that could be a indirect beneficiary of AI. We've seen the trillion-dollar tech companies. I think we could see a trillion-dollar healthcare company. The parts where I tend to take the under on are, yeah, like AGI, and then also like robotics, which are getting better, but they are energy intensive. Operating in the real world, material intensive, and hard to do in the field. Like full self-driving has already taken longer than a lot of people thought. Um, and partially it's the tech itself, partially it's regulation. Anytime you're operating in the real environment, where people can be harmed by mistakes. Um, and simply, when you ask, like, okay, when can a robot come out and like fix my HVAC system and leave, right? It's one thing to have robots like in a factory, like a very controlled environment, doing repetitive tasks, and then having a small number of technicians that are able to like deal with edge cases and fix things that pop up. Things that operate in the field are 10x harder, because you're in this uncontrolled environment. And I think that's just that kind of technological progress and growth generally takes longer than people think. Like software can often go faster than you think, whereas hardware often takes longer than you think. And that's, as from someone who's worked in hardware, just the number of moving parts, literally, but also just like the whole everything about it is just super hard.
Well, so I very much tend to agree with you. And I actually don't know if you know this, but I came before getting into investing from the solar energy industry. And like, it's been a decade long slog of building a company called Bright, which is like Sunrun for Mexico, and like moving atoms, even without the moving robotic parts, way harder than moving bits. 100% with you. However, I was going to say to your point about the robots, I just saw robots rave last week at the Tesla Day. So I don't know, that did shock me a little bit.
I still
Um,
I think it's one of those things. I think there'll be really cool demonstrations. And
yeah.
there's like, what was that one? It was one of the Japanese companies did like Azimo or something, and that was like 20 some years ago.
Hmm.
It was this like robot, and that one cost like $3 million. Um, and now there's similar tech that can do that for 5 or 6 figures. So there is progress here. It's just like in the field, in non-controlled environments, it's just shockingly hard. It's like a very very hard problem to work through.
Yeah, no, agreed. Couple more questions on this, and I know we're coming up on our time. You mentioned that you see AI as an extension of cloud, and I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. One thing that I wanted to touch on again, just in the interest of always being intellectually honest, like I love open source software. That's a big part of the reason I love Bitcoin. It's a big part of the reason I love Nostr. I see Bitcoin as sort of commons money. Nostr is like data commons. I love all of that. However, I'm also a venture capitalist, and as an investor, I like making money. And so one thing that I've just I've tried to be very honest with myself about lately is if you look at, I don't know if you track like the open source companies very much, but basically companies that are built around sort of open source projects. And so an example of this would be like MongoDB or Elastic or Confluent or HashiCorp, those kinds of companies, Red Hat to a degree. And traditionally, sort of the idea high level is you create some open source software that's super amazing. A lot of developers love it because it's easy. They can contribute back to it. Amazing. Open source is clearly, at least in my opinion, a better way to create and distribute software. And the idea was, well, you can monetize this because you're the best one in the position to either host that software or offer services around it, or like literally just service level agreements. And that kind of worked for a while. In the last couple of years, though, we started to see some of these numbers stagnate at best and decline for some of these companies. HashiCorp obviously had a really big fight recently. WordPress is going through a very interesting fight right now about who can and can't host services. And if I'm being very honest with myself, one take that I've been thinking more about is like, who's the big winner of open source so far? I mean, AWS seems like they are the open source winner, and that's obviously a very centralized company. So I'm just curious, would you agree with that take? Does that make you any more or less bearish on companies building around open source? Are there new business models? If someone's trying to build an open source focused company today, how would you think about that?
I think the winner ends up being the users as well as those big platform aggregators. So kind of like two sides of the thing, like the biggest, most centralized things, and also the users. Whereas the multitude of companies in the middle tend to be more middlemen or tend to have weaker economic moats um, than a big proprietary trillion-dollar tech stack. Is probably how I view it. Um, I think it's kind of like not building on open source gives you a lot of inherent kind of advantages in some sense. But I think that over time, it's very hard to operate closed things as more and more open source stuff becomes available, and has really strong like updating and developing communities built around it. Um, but I do think that the profit that can be extracted from being the best operator and service provider for open source is never going to make you a Google. You know,
Yeah.
it's more of like a business that can be sustaining, but is not necessarily some gigantic powerhouse, and maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Maybe the
it's
structure of the world just changes in that.
yeah, it's generally how I view it. I think basically the hosting and processing environment is always going to be very important. There's always going to be winners there, and then I think hopefully users. Maybe an analogy I would give is that the invention of the ETF was a massive deal, and now it's a multi-trillion-dollar asset under management thing. If you look at the companies that run the ETFs, you have BlackRock, Vanguard, which is like owned by its own funds. That's not, it's kind of like not even a for profit at some point. And then you have like State Street, and Invesco, and they're like, they're big, but they're not like big, right? So like if I look at BlackRock, their market cap is $160 billion, which for the world's biggest asset manager
Yeah.
is not as big as you think. Um, and only about half that's ETF. So like, let's say their ETF business is worth $80 billion. What's Vanguard's worth if they were like a full-on, full profit company? Probably like another 80 billion. I mean, Invesco is tiny. Invesco is, and I have a point to all this. I know I'm rambling, but like Invesco is 8 billion. State Street, I mean, most of what they do is not ETFs, but they happen to have a big ETF business, and they're 27 billion. So, I mean, probably 10 billion of that's ETFs. I mean, the entire like ETF providers as like a market cap is a couple $100 billion,
Yeah.
and it's like a $10 trillion space. So it's like there actually was not a lot of value extraction to be made, despite the fact that ETFs are super useful for the end user. It's just way better than mutual funds. It's way better than what came before. Super cheap, super liquid. Um, but there's actually somewhat limited value extraction from that. And there's a race to the bottom with fees. Um, and that you can only build so big of a business on that. And I think that that's good technology kind of goes in that direction where there are winners in the space, but that the true winners are the users,
Yeah.
and that there's a limited amount of value extraction that can be had in that stack.
Yeah. And to be clear, so I agree with you. I love all of that. As an investor, I still think there's opportunities to make some
Yeah,
huge like returns here. But like, yeah, like will we ever see a company that's percentage wise as dominant, let's say a decade out after this wave has played out, as the Metas and the Googles and the Amazons and the Apples? Probably not. And that's probably a good thing for the world. Doesn't mean you can't get 100 or 1,000 or even a 10,000 Xer if you're going early
yeah,
stage. But like, it just seems structurally better for humanity. Kind of to your point, it seems like a much better, healthier balance of permaculture of the economy. And I had a Ben Ark, I'm sure you know Ben from Ellen Bits on recently. And one thing that he said that I just can't stop thinking about, it's like one of the first times I've heard someone articulate it so clearly. He's very much someone who's sort of like in the Hegelian dialectic world, like synthesis, antithesis, or sorry, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And, he came in as kind of like a lefty type, hangs out with a bunch of ANCAP Bitcoiners. And his synthesis, which I really love, was something where he calls basically like we're building open source software as new kinds of commons, and these commons allow free markets to thrive. Like you can't have a free market without real commons for money, commons for data, commons for payments. That's what I would argue that Bitcoin, Nostr, and Lightning Network are. But then you can actually build real businesses, and maybe they're not as big as Google, but maybe that's great, and you can still have some incredibly successful companies, but people end up winning. And I really love that idea of like maybe it's not It's not full on leftism. It's not full on ANCAPism. It's something that has elements of both in there.
Yeah, I think the open source like that is interesting. I guess anything where there's like because software is cheaper than hardware.
Right.
We've been, inherently software is more prone to that open source type of culture than something hardware focused. And I do think that's a really good precedent that's come out of development for decades now is the open source space. It's something that Jack Dorsey focuses on a lot and supports. It's something I think we should continue to support. Like, so like I look at things from a venture standpoint, but I also look at things from a grant standpoint. What things do I think are useful to exist from a human flourishing perspective that might not be inherently economical or might not be economical in, say, a 5-year period? Or if they are economical, I'd be worried about the incentives of them being economical. And that instead it's something that probably should just exist.
And, and
Um,
and I heard you mention, Lynn, I didn't realize this. Do you do like your own personal grants? I don't know if you have like a formal program for that, or is it just something you do one off?
I do small little one-offs, but mainly I'll donate to like the HRF or other entities
Yeah.
to try to because they have a better curation process than I have bandwidth for.
Yeah.
But yeah, little small ones here and there. And I think that that mix is good because there are some things that I think the for-profit model makes sense for,
Right.
and that it benefits from scaling. You want that incentive of like we want to get in here and we want to win and we want to be the biggest and we want to hit this hard, and that's where scaling and capital can really be helpful. And there's other things that are inherently just you want someone spending time on providing this thing or fixing this or making this an option that people can use, and it's scrappier and in some ways it's more pure because it's this thing that's just out there now.
Yeah, I love it.
um,
Lynn, I know we're coming up on time. Do you have time for two final questions? If not,
yep,
no
I'm
worries.
good.
Okay. So I know we talked about everything under the sun, which is awesome. That's what I love for this podcast. But I do want to ask you two Bitcoin questions. And I'm
Sure.
curious where you take these. And perhaps these are also jumping off points for future conversations. The first one is a provocative conversation that came up in our podcast last week. I've been thinking about this question for over a year now, 2 years now, and I still don't know the answer. So I'm curious your take. Does Bitcoin bring more users to Nostr, or does Nostr bring more users to Bitcoin? Like, let's say, in the long run, over 10 years out.
I can see a case for either. I actually don't have high conviction on that. Like when I put my go back to like my bearish bull stance, which is that network effects are really hard to chip into. So Bitcoin's chipping into like the multi-$100 trillion global fiat government backed like network effect. That's a long process. And Nas is chipping into the big centralized hyperscale social media companies. Um, and I think both of those probably take a while.
Yeah.
Um, I there are like Boolean outcomes that I don't think I just don't have confidence that I'm going to predict. Like for example, if there's some killer app that that gets catches on Nostr, and then the whole thing hits 10 million users before I think it will, or 100 million users before I think it will, um, then that can change my thesis for okay now Nostr is going to probably bring more people to Bitcoin than the other way around. Um, and so I think there's a case to be made that Nostr, despite being the newer technology, could bring more people to Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin right now is probably in a phase where it's going to grow in like institutional level stuff. Um, I think that retail has just been so burned by the crypto space.
Yeah.
They've been so preyed upon,
Yeah. It's
uh,
pretty fucked up.
and it's most people cannot be expected to say, okay, let's do a 100-hour dive into like economics and software and politics, and so most people don't do that. The ones that do it benefit from doing it, but the ratio of people that do is pretty low. Um, and so I think that probably in the next cycle, Bitcoin scales from like more and more money managers getting into it, sovereigns dabbling in it, corporations dabbling in it, MicroStrategy eating up more Bitcoin. When you break out to all-time highs, you get some retail involvement. You get the phone calls from relatives that are like, "Hey, remember that Bitcoin thing you mentioned, last cycle? And can you give me an update on that?" So like, it's not that I think that
Oh, no,
retail is
not
not good.
not this guy again. The Bitcoin guy again. He was right. Shit.
Yeah, exactly. So I think I mean there will be more retail cycles, but I'm just not convinced they'll be like fully retail driven. Um, Whereas like Nostr could hit bigger numbers. If some app really catches on, and for me, that's like the lightning in a bottle that's really hard to predict.
Totally. Yeah, I also, I've gone back and forth on this. If force me to pick one, I would probably say Nostr brings more to Bitcoin today just because of those, like the unpredictable, right? Like before Nassim Taleb became a full-on shitcoiner, I really liked his sort of anti-fragile look on life. And like, yeah, I want exposure to like the breakout case. I think there's more opportunity for that Nostr. But on the other hand, like I also think that I think it's going to keep feeding back and forth with each other. Like I think that, if we're about to get a bull run, and it certainly seems like that, then I think that's going to bring a lot of people to Nostr because now it's like, hey, there's this thing that just 10x in value or whatever Bitcoin does. Like, wonder where I can earn some of that free stuff. Oh, what's this Nostr thing? So you can get a lot more people. As those people start going, more of them are developers, more of them have use cases. Boom, maybe one of them comes up with the killer app. But we'll see. So I think that's interesting. And then I actually had another question for you, but you brought up one that I have to ask. MicroStrategy going crazy. Everyone's talking about it. So I'm looking at this as Sats per share, which is very interesting. It seems like Saylor's got that figured out. Seems like he's found a cheat code. One, do you think that kind of like high premium he's trading at right now is sustainable, or could it get much higher? And two, why aren't we seeing more people mimicking this? Is it just that there's no other founder control that can make this kind of a run?
I think a lot of it is the founder control issue. Basically, if you have a large business that still some way operates like a small business, um, and that's the cheat code because then you have access to public markets, but you also have high conviction decision makers that can get that process started. We see like Meta Planets doing it. But I am surprised that not more have done it. For MicroStrategy, I mean, one of the things they're tapping into is that there are trillions and trillions of dollars of managed capital with mandates.
Yep.
So, like a stock fund portfolio manager can only buy stocks, and if he happens to be a Bitcoiner, he can't buy like the Bitcoin ETF because it's not like a company. He can only buy companies in his mandate. And so, if he wants to express his bullish Bitcoin view, it's either MicroStrategy or the miners.
Yep.
Um, yeah, pretty much. Um, and same thing, there are bond fund investors that happen to be Bitcoiners or just like the Bitcoin thesis and say, hey, I can buy this convertible bond that mostly protects my downside, and I have to buy bonds. I can't buy the Bitcoin fund and stick it in my bond fund, but I can buy this bond issued by a Bitcoin company that gives me upside if Bitcoin 10x's.
Yeah.
Um, and so right now, I think that the premium reflects the fact that there's this pretty large amount of mandated capital that's interested,
Yeah.
and there's a market for it. I don't try to predict how high it could go. When the premium gets this high, my caution is, look, I mean, I just like Bitcoin better than like owning something that gives you like a third of the Bitcoin for your dollar. But that kind of shows that the runway is probably pretty big, that they can issue a lot more capital and still have a premium, which means they're going to suck up a lot more Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So instead, I don't view it as trying to predict how sustainable it is, but I do view it as a marker of how much unmet demand there is for Bitcoin in these mandated pools of capital. And right now, the answer is there's a lot more demand for it.
Yep.
Um, and then there's a liquidity network effect. So because they were like first to do it and they didn't mess around, they did it at scale.
Yep.
Um, they now have a liquidity network effect. So MicroStrategy has higher volume than the BlackRock Bitcoin ETF, which is
Right. But it's
kind of
crazy.
insane.
Yeah. It's,
Um, and when you add the volume of all, and they already had like BlackRock is just now going to launch like an options market around their Bitcoin ETF, whereas MicroStrategy already has an options market. And options markets are pretty challenging things to get enough liquidity for because it's not just one thing; it's a bunch of different strike prices and a bunch of different expiries, right? So it's actually like a market of a bunch of illiquid things, and so it actually takes a lot of liquidity to have a reasonably liquid options market around a given product. So it's not like every ETF is going to have a liquid options market. Probably the BlackRock one will. And MicroStrategy already has a liquid options market, and that's a really big self-sustaining network effect that makes that the de facto one to go to. So um, I think they're going to gobble up a lot more Bitcoin, basically.
yeah. Yeah, no, I love that. And there's actually one other group of capital. I don't know how it compares sort of order of magnitude, but I myself, by accident, was in this group of capital, which is people with Vanguard accounts. I wanted to put my Roth IRA. Like, I didn't want to put in all the effort to figure out how to self custody the coins or whatever. So it's like, all right, well, I can't buy the ETF, which I probably would have bought. So it's like, all right, MicroStrategy is the only way I can express my position. And then I looked at it and I was like, what the fuck? Like, how is this happening? And of course, the more people say that, the more eyes they get on it, the more the brand grows, blah, blah. So I think that's all very interesting. Last question I want to touch on you, and perhaps, this really is just the beginning of a future conversation because this one could go very long, but I at least want to get your high level take on this. I mentioned to you that prior to getting into Bitcoin, I'm coming from the energy industry, and I'm very much sort of a solar bull. That's how I got into this. I was just watching the cost per kilowatt hour declining very rapidly. Part of the thing that really I clicked with Bitcoin on is seeing it as energy backed money, which, one of my personal heroes is Buckminster Fuller. I've seen him, Ford, Edison, all of these people call for energy backed money. In my opinion, the only currency of the known universe, full stop. It's calories, kilowatt hours, joules. That's it. And so, one thing that I've been thinking about, A, I'm curious if you sort of agree with that assessment, Bitcoin is energy backed money. And B, there's this one guy, I think it's Capriel Investments. I don't know if you follow him at all. And he's got many different metrics on his chart. I can share with you. It's quite interesting. It's something I've been following quite closely since like 2018 or 19. And one of his charts is, let me find it for you, looking at the Bitcoin energy value. And literally, so he trades Bitcoin. I'll send it to you on another channel. He trades Bitcoin um, based on its energy production cost, and that's been one of the like most wildly like consistent predictors of Bitcoin being over undervalued. So I'm just curious if that's something you've modeled at all. If you have any agreement or disagreement or any opinion whatsoever on that thesis.
Well, I do agree that it's energy-backed money, and I think that I mean, that's why I like it more than proof of stake. That external entropy, that external variable, is what makes it not circular logic, right?
Yep,
So with proof of
exactly.
stake, it's like the ledger. Who controls the ledger? They control the ledger, but they're also determined from the prior state of the ledger. So it's like this recursive thing that if you ever have a failure mode, only a bunch of people in a chat room can put it back together. It's like a
Yep,
governance decision. Whereas having that external energy component is what makes it a more truly autonomous system. Um, there, so I have not been familiar with this specific one, but it's actually this looks very similar to Blockware Solutions. Also, that has like an energy density or an energy mass model that they've had for a few years.
hmm.
Um, and I do pay attention to that. I do think it's a relevant way of looking at it because if if you can make a lot more money from mining than from Bitcoin, then some capital that would otherwise buy Bitcoin goes into making and buying more ASICs and data centers and getting that all spun up. Um, Whereas either because Bitcoin rises or because the hash rate goes so much that Bitcoin mining becomes more tightly less profitable, then if you're looking at the marginal dollar, you're just like, well, I'm just going to buy Bitcoin.
Yeah,
Um, and so I do think that when the price is closer to its energy floor, um, I think that's a relevant factor. It's probably not the main factor that I use, but it's certainly one of them. The other one I use, and this one's really simple, is just the MVRV Z score, which is basically market value compared to realized value, and realized value is basically just on-chain cost basis.
yep,
So like all the UTXOs at the last dollar price they moved at, um, with the idea being that you can't necessarily track what people are doing on exchanges, but the price at which they pull Bitcoin off an exchange, or the price that they put Bitcoin onto an exchange, is a really relevant kind of point of data in aggregate.
hmm.
And so when you have the market value go up way faster than the cost basis, it's like in some ways that's not really consummated yet. Like that's not
Yeah,
traded enough volume to really kind of have that be the new true price yet. And only once that's chopped around for a long time and then that cost basis really catches up, and a lot of Bitcoin have actually traded hands and moved from exchange to exchange at that level, does that become more of a true price.
yep,
Um, and so I look at, how extended is the market value versus the realized value. And in some ways I kind of use that like that cost base is kind of like the true market value of the network in some ways. And that
yep.
that tends to be more of a solidly up and to the right metric. So I'm always more comfortable when you don't have a really big multiple gap between those two.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. Lyn, this is absolutely fascinating. I would love for us, if you're down for to talk more about energy sometime, because I know that could be its own like 2 hour
Sure.
pod. But we've been going for a while. Thank you so much. Any closing thoughts? Anything you want to leave folks with? Obviously, I think folks can find you on Twitter, Lyn Alden Contact. You're on Nostr, which is where you're a lot more fun. So people should totally find you on there. What else? Anything you want to end with?
I mean, I think a big theme today is just the com the complexity of systems.
Yeah.
That there are, there are some systems that are entirely human designed and therefore they can be mostly human understood, but there are other systems that are emergent in one way or another, either from the natural world or from so many humans coming together and interoperating, that you can never fully model them, and therefore you have to inherently approach them humbly and appreciate their emergent properties. And mainly the function there is having a good enough model to understand a couple major inputs and outputs and governing logic of what's happening, but then two, being able to iterate your understanding of that system quickly based on data, and less about like what should be and keep attention to what is, because then what is can help inform you of what should be, because there's so many variables that knowing what should be is inherently an incredibly hard question. But seeing what is, and then asking yourself, why is this one winning, or why is this one working, or why did this deviate from what I thought? It's all about updating your model as quickly as possible whenever you're dealing with one of these really complex emergent systems.
Complexity rules everything around me. And on that excellent ending note, thank you so much, Lyn. And yeah, hopefully we get to do this again soon.
Yeah, thank you.